Hello. Okay, so we are here again. And last time we got to speak to Paul Holder. And before that, we got to speak to Karen, who founded the Radish Ranch. And today we get to speak to two other members of the professional team for Camp Attach. So, hi, guys. Thanks for being here.
Hey,
Hello.
very good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So if you guys would just be willing to introduce your names, what your role is at Camp Attach, and explain Camp Attach in your own words.
Okay. So my name is Yoder, and I am one of the team leaders at Camp Attach. My role at Camp Attach is very diverse. I feel like I kind of fill in a lot of little spaces there, but I tend to be the one who communicates a lot with the families beforehand, just communicating what they need to bring, and getting some of that information that makes it a great experience for them. And a little bit about Camp Attach in my own words would be that it is a week-long family bonding camp where families can come and parents can get tools for their family to help their to just have less chaos in their home, and parents get to understand their kids and kids get to understand themselves more, and it's a really, really great learning opportunity for the whole family. So that would be a little bit about camp in my own words.
My name is Trevor, and it's my wife. I was more or less brought into this based on that fact. So I feel a little bit out of place sometimes simply because this isn't like growing up, I really didn't have any connection to attachment or trauma or anything like that. So I sometimes feel a little odd when stuff like that gets brought up. A lot of times people have connections to trauma in some way or another that brings them to camp, but I don't. So my role at camp mainly is working with Ophelia, our therapy dog. So that means I spend a lot of time in the intervention room. I spend a lot of time interacting with parents, just providing that calming presence. But yeah, describing Camp Attach in my own words is difficult. It's such a big event, and I feel like it has like a really strong potential in families that are looking for help to get them started on their healing journey, or provide them a boost if they've already started that journey. And it encompasses a lot of things. But yeah, I think I would echo the fact that, like Anne talked about, the providing tools for parents to help their children heal is probably one of the biggest things that we focus on at camp.
Yeah, that's great. And it is wonderful to watch Trevor I've seen him once in the intervention room with his dog. And actually, if one of you would explain what the intervention room is, I kind of mentioned it with Karen and Paul, but I don't think we really explained what it was. Would either of you want to take a go at it?
Sure, I'll give it a shot.
Okay.
Anne can chime in and fix my description of it. So the intervention room at camp is where we as volunteers and staff take children to keep them safe and to keep their families safe, to help them regain their self-control and their composure, maybe I would say, but to help them get them thinking correctly. And we have different tools that we use in the intervention room to help that child regulate themselves. So that's kind of what it is. It's literally we're intervening for that kid when that kid does not have the self-control that they need.
Yeah. And the goal is the kids go in the intervention room, when they are making poor choices or, using a part of their brain that is not making good choices. And our goal in the intervention room is to just shift them over so that they can make good choices, because, we believe that kids can make good choices and can develop that ability to regulate, like we talked about, and shift. So yeah, it's a good place.
Yeah, well, thank you. So we got a little bit here of how kind of Trevor, you heard about Camp Attach through Anne, which makes sense. So Anne, when did you first hear about Camp Attach, and do you want to share as little or as much as you would like?
Yeah, sure. So I first heard about Camp Attach when I was 15 years old, because I was a child struggling with reactive attachment disorder. And at that point in my life, I was at a residential treatment facility, and my parents, kind of unbeknownst to me, were looking for a step that not only would help me fix my behavior, but also fix the broken core of the attachment wound. And so, they picked me up and they told me that, we're going to go someplace, and they didn't tell me where exactly. But anyway, we pull up to this kind of campground facility. And I was like, oh, okay, this seems interesting. And we walked in, and there were just a bunch of people smiling and saying, welcome to my parents, and, get ready, your life's about to change. Welcome to Camp Attach. And that was my first introduction to Camp Attach. At that point, I had no idea what it was, but that was the very first time I heard about it, is walking into that room and having everyone, just kind of surround my parents and be excited and be happy and welcoming us to Camp Attach.
And did you, when it was interesting when I was speaking with Karen, that she was saying it's really difficult to actually diagnose a child with reactive attachment disorder. Were you officially diagnosed, or was it just?
I'm not actually sure. I think so. Yes. But
Okay.
I'm not positive of that.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I know that you guys don't work just with kids with reactive attachment disorder, but a lot of those symptoms are whatever. So, and I just found that interesting, because when I heard of camp, it was because I happened to work with a little girl with reactive attachment disorder. It was like the first child I'd worked with attachment trauma before. So I just kind of assumed it was normal, but I realized that it's maybe not as normal, because I've worked with other children who have attachment trauma, but they're not that extreme.
Yes. Yes.
So then what would you say the rest of your experience was being at camp as a child who was struggling?
So yeah, I quickly realized that camp was a place to learn, and that camp was a place where you're shifting that family dynamic. And as a child with attachment issues, that can be a really scary thing, because, the way things were going, where I was, I had these control issues. I had all of these behaviors that were very negative. It was scary to think of coming to a more positive place in life. And I quickly realized that was what camp was all about. And they did that in a way where they were very focused on the parents and celebrating the parents. And so my initial thoughts of camp were, this is going to be awful. And, just kind of keep my head down and try to slide through the week unnoticed. But as the week went on, I quickly realized that camp became a place where we had a lot of fun. And one of the things I would say about my experience at Camp Attach is I realized that as a family, we could have fun doing things that were positive, like playing fun games and, doing random activities together. And we could have fun as a family. And that was a really cool thing to realize as a child with attachment issues. And then also realizing, understanding more about who I was and why I was making the choices I was, and that it wasn't that I was just bad. It was that, because of trauma, there was a faulty belief system there that was kind of, creating some of those reactions. And so camp was really helpful. I would say my experience was positive in just understanding myself, having fun with my family, and eventually attaching and feeling a connection for the first time in my life to my parents. So that is my experience at camp.
Excellent. And I know, I like how you express that it's scary. From what I understand from and you use the word, one of you guys used the words chaos in your introduction to the families living in chaos. And I have heard that, I don't know if I was listening to Dr. Bruce Perry or who I was listening to, but not that we like chaos, but if it's what you're familiar with, it's where your safety is, right? So, So the safety for the kids. So what are some of the ways that you can either share from your own experience or ways that you see kids, just so maybe parents who do hear this don't feel so alone if they have children that are the ways that children I mean, every child probably does this a little differently, but the ways that they will try to sabotage the bond that parents are attempting to make.
Yeah, and I think that's super important to recognize that. I love that you mentioned like parents aren't alone, because like in the work I do and also just knowing my life journey, like there are so many children and families out there that are struggling, and RAD and attachment is something that I feel like people struggle with so silently, and there's that there's not the community that there should be surrounding it. But some of the things that I did to sabotage that bonding with my parents is severe control issues. I mean, we talked a lot about that. What does that look like in practicality? Trying to have all the information that, of who my mom is texting, what we're going to be doing every single night of the week. And if I didn't like it, throwing a fit big enough to ruin it. Lying, manipulation, triangulating at school, creating a lot of issues at my school, telling my teachers how awful my parents are when in reality they were like the best people ever. And talking, just sabotaging my parents' reputation verbally there. And then also just being hateful towards my parents, a lot of disrespect and things like that. And all of those behaviors are push away behaviors that create that divide. Because I mean, they are ugly behaviors. They're not fun behaviors to be around. And so, it's hard to bond with a porcupine. So, yeah.
And either of you can answer this question. Do you feel like there's, or both an answer from both of you, but there's misconceptions. Do you feel like there's misconceptions about, well, adoption in general? Like, do we romanticize it? And then when adoption falls apart, or not necessarily falls apart because it didn't fall apart for you, but your parents sent you away for a while. And I'm sure probably people didn't necessarily understand that or whatever, but do you have any thoughts on what misconceptions are?
That is a very good question. And I think it's one of those things, we were talking about this a little bit. It's one of those things that there's kind of two sides to it. Like, one of the misconceptions is that when you adopt, if you have biological children, or even if you don't, that it's going to just be like a normal child. You're bringing a normal child into your home. You can use all the normal tools and it will all be fine. If you love this child enough, surely, it'll all work out. And that is not the reality, because they have a history outside of you if you were an adoptive parent. And then I think on the flip side of that, though, the other misconception is that, adopted kids are always going to be a problem, and they're always going to have issues, and they can never be, positive contributors to society or to their families. And that is not necessarily true either. So I think those are, and again, there's kind of a ditch on either side. And just so I think, the balance of understanding that there is a history outside of you as an adoptive parent, and that will create waves, and that will create bumps that you will need to work through. And that child does have trauma that they will need to process. But also understanding that there is hope, and they can overcome it and become really, really awesome people. And so, that's what I would say a little bit about the misconceptions there. That I feel like surround adoption is kind of the ditch on either side.
Yeah, I would say that the most common misconception that I've seen is the whole, like, adopted kids often really struggle and often have a lot of behavioral issues, and it's kind of like, well, you hope they grow out of it, but there's not really much you can do. And it's kind of what I've seen the most. But again, I wouldn't say that outside of Camp Attach, I have a ton of history with adoption. It's not like I have adopted siblings. I have a few adopted cousins, but that's as far as it goes. So those are some of the misconceptions that I've more or less picked up from camp itself. So I think my opinion of that is kind of skewed.
Yes. And I don't know if there's also misconceptions about like how trauma works. Do people like assume that if the kid because I know that Miss Teresa does a good job expressing that they're high risk factors. They're not necessarily like concrete, like A plus B equals C. It's a potential. Like, how would you explain that the high risk factors versus like it doesn't necessarily cause this specific thing?
Well, I mean, I think, humans as a whole are very diverse. And I think that different people have different resilience levels. Some people are naturally more resilient than other people. And so, yes, you have a list of different risk factors that can contribute in early childhood, in utero even, that can contribute to developing that unstable inner world or that unstable belief system. But again, like, you have those different resilience factors. So some kids who have even experienced maybe more risk factors may struggle differently than a child who has experienced less risk factors. And I've seen children who we have more knowledge of the trauma that has happened to them, and they don't struggle as significantly as a child whose history we don't know. For me, we don't know a whole lot about my history, but yet I struggled pretty severely. And then other children that I know that have more significant trauma, if you will, have not struggled as intensely and have been able to process that better. I think that has a lot to do with resilience factors. And also, I mean, resources that you have available. I think in the more recent years, there is many more resources available, and there's much more openness surrounding conversations on adoption and trauma. And so I think that's great. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that would kind of be my take on the risk factors versus the level of struggle. Is I think it has a lot to do with resilience factor there too as well.
Yeah, and like the one thing, like a lot of times when we hear the word resilient, we think of like strength and weakness, like a person who's resilient, strong, and that's not necessarily the connotation that she was talking about. I don't think. Just because a kid develops reactive attachment disorder after they've gone through trauma doesn't mean that they're weak. A lot of times the weak kids simply don't survive. So they're strong. But at the same time, they've developed a lot of really poor mental habits. Well, I don't even know if I want to say that they developed it or that, because it almost feels like then that child has a choice in the trauma. And that's not necessarily completely, they have a choice of what they're going to do with it, but nobody chooses to be traumatized. But that child, when they go through that trauma, each kid, because they process it differently, is going to have a different outcome.
Yeah. Well, and I think also understanding that, like, so for those risk factors, each of those behaviors that the child has, those negative behaviors, each of those behaviors was a way that they learned to keep themselves safe in the unsafe situations that they faced, right? And so, I think if you look at it like that, I mean, all children who have trauma are resilient because they're all developing these skills, whether they're positive or negative, to survive. And the problem comes when they cannot realize that they are now in a safe situation and they don't need those skills anymore. Yeah. So I don't know if you need more clarification on that one, that's fine.
No, that's great. It's a little abstract. So
Yeah. I feel like there's a lot of really heavy ideas thrown out there all at once.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. So, Anne, I guess we didn't really officially say, but you were adopted, right? Do you have if you were going to give a little bit of your adoption story, what would you say?
Yeah. Yes. So I was officially adopted. I was born in Kazakhstan, which is a country that borders Russia. And we don't know a whole lot about my history there. Like I kind of mentioned, we do know my birth mother was very young and she did leave me at the hospital there. So like I never lived with my birth family. And then I went to an orphanage there in Kazakhstan, and pretty much, I mean, lived life. I was very small. I was under 5 pounds. So I was a very small baby. And so I had a lot of growing to do there. And so that was one of the risk factors, is just that, having to physically survive. But then once going to the orphanage that I went to was one of the best orphanages around that area of Kazakhstan. And I think the interesting part about that is that even though it was one of the best, there still was not adequate care for all of the needs for all the kiddos there. And so, it wasn't even necessarily that there was any significant abuse or neglect. It's just that there wasn't adequate care for all of the needs there. And so I stayed at the orphanage until I was 13 months old. And then I came home to live with my adoptive parents. And they're fantastic. I mean, and so from 13 months on, my life was great. My life was very normal. My life was very good. But that trauma still played its effect on our family. But my parents were fantastic. And as soon as I came home to live with them, my life stabilized, as far as physical safety, mental safety, and emotional safety. So that's a little bit of my adoption journey. We went to camp. I mentioned I went to the residential when I was 14, and I came home when I was 17, and we went to camp when I was 15. So that's kind of the journey there as far as attachment goes. And when I came home at 17 from the residential, I was healthy in the way I processed life. Yes, you still have those scars of attachment and trauma, but I was a positive member, I was a contributing member of society and our family, and, had it successfully attached to my parents. And we had a really great relationship at that point. So yeah, that's a little bit about my adoption journey. That's it in a very short nutshell.
I was talking to a foster mom once, and because she has a little girl with reactive attachment disorder, and she was like listening to someone's story about them being a rad mom, but their daughter wasn't even living with them. And so in her mind, she's like, well, how is that a rad mom? But I know that your mom was, and probably your dad too, I just don't know your dad, was very intentional in ways that she could be. Like, so what were, even though you needed the residential space for, I don't know how you explained why you needed it. You could probably tell us why you needed it too, but what was your mom doing to help build the attachment even while you were there?
Yeah, my mom was really great. She was very intentional in writing letters. Here's what we did as a family, and different things like that. They would come and visit me. So periodically they would come for, an evening or a weekend or something like that and visit me there at the residential. But one of the things that sticks out to me when I think about the intentional ways that she worked on that attachment piece at the residential is one time at Thanksgiving, she wrote me a letter and she said, hey, we set a place for you at the Thanksgiving table, and we hope you get strong enough to make good choices so that you can join us next year. Or I don't even know that she said next year, but in other words, so that you can join us in the future. And so that, hey, we still believe in you, we still support you, but you do have to make better choices before you can come back into our family. And so I think that's a way that sticks out in my mind. That was a very intentional piece, I think, but she was really great at that. So writing a lot of letters, she visited some, and as far as that's about what you're limited to when it comes to a residential. We did have some phone calls, but that's about kind of what you're limited to at a residential, because we needed that safe place for me to be, because my behavior was so out of control at home. And so we needed those extra resources that the residential could provide there.
Well, I think that just gives a lot of hope, because I think some people, and I'm obviously it wouldn't work out this way for every child, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee it's the end just because you're sending your child to a residential program or whatever.
Right. Absolutely. No, I mean, for some families, it is a needed step, and that is okay. And that just means that's a step in the child's journey. But absolutely, that does not mean they can't heal. That doesn't mean, that just means that's a step in their journey. Yeah.
So then how did you officially start when were you at the place where you started getting involved with Nancy, or just even helping other children or parents, or I don't even know how did that start for you?
Yeah. So for me, that started when I was 18. I mentioned I came home from the residential at 17, and we had attended Camp Attach as a family. And so one of the things my mom and I had discussed is we would love to go back and volunteer together. Because for us, that's what created that attachment. That's what created that connection point. And we wanted to give back. And so when I was 18, we decided that was the year we wanted to do it. And so we did. We attended Camp Attach as volunteers then. And that was Teresa Gerard at that point was the kind of one organizing the camp. And yeah, it was really awesome. It was cool to see that other side of it. And to be on the other side of it. And so that's when I first got involved with Camp Attach. And then I also started doing respite, some therapeutic respite for families around that same time as well. And so that was kind of yet another level of working in attachment, which was fantastic. And then when I was 19, I started going back to college to get a degree as a therapist, so that I can work on a therapy level with kids with attachment issues. And I have some work to do there yet in that schoolwork. But so those are kind of the different levels that I've worked towards, continuing my work in attachment. But first started Camp Attach when I was 18, and it was a really great experience.
Yeah, part of me just can't even imagine being a kid who was there attending and then being able to go and volunteering. I hope that filled you with some sense of I want to say pride, and I mean pride in a good way, right? Because we need some sense of oh, I can do this, and I am. Yeah, so that's great.
Yeah, there was definitely a sense of it that first going back, I was a little terrified to go back because I was what if they say I'm still rad? What happens then? Because at that point I knew I was attached, but there was still that fear, kind of like we talked about that scar of attachment. And so going back was extremely redemptive because, it allowed me to see from other people's perspective as well and have them speak into my life that I was different and they recognized that. And so it was extremely redemptive. And it very much did fill me with a sense of, I can do this. And I did do that. And that's awesome. So, yeah.
And throughout your whole, not even maybe necessarily directed with Camp Attach, but your own personal story and the experiences that you have had, it's redemptive for you and it's redemptive for a lot of other people. I mean, and evil isn't something we can necessarily avoid. Well, no, we can't. When I know that your family is very faithful and loves the Lord. So what do you feel like God, speaks to you personally? He has something that is deeply individual and unique for you that is not going to be for any other person in the rest of the world. This is abstract too, because I'm a little abstract. But if you want to just talk about a little bit about your relationship with the Lord and maybe struggling with the wounds of attachment wounds and how that's whatever God has taught you in that, but also in context of Camp Attach.
Yes. Okay. I will do my best to answer that question. Yeah, so I definitely did. Growing up, I believe our family was, my parents are very strong Christians. They're really amazing, like I mentioned, amazing people, fantastic, they're believers. And so I was taught a lot about the Bible growing up. And I always wanted to follow the Lord. Although my heart was very hard in a lot of ways and very calloused, there always was kind of a soft spot towards God. And I wanted to do what was right. But again, that self-control piece and that trauma piece battled intensely with that desire. And so when I was at the residential, and I had been there for 2 years at that point and was spinning my wheels, I had begun to kind of process some of that trauma. I had begun to realize what it looks like to attach to my parents, or at least kind of dabbled in that feeling of, hey, this is a little bit of what it feels like to connect to my parents. I processing that, and then for me, the question always was, if God knew every day that I would live before I was ever born, and he set this up like this, how is that loving? I really struggled with that core question for myself. Like, how is it loving to cause this much pain for myself and for me to cause this much pain to my family? How is that loving? And I struggled with that, again, that core kind of question there. But again, as I began to process that little bit of, here's what it feels like to connect to my family, and here's what it does feel like when I do make good choices, do right things. I began to understand that the redemption is part of the plan, right? Like, so yes, he took me through this pain. He took my family through this pain. But at the same time, he was not going to just leave it there. And for me, I think just finding that you were there, like, in other words, God was there. And he was there in the pain. And again, like you mentioned, you can't escape evil. He did not create brokenness. That wasn't his plan. And his plan is to redeem and to, he has good things in store for the people, he talks about that. And so, yeah, I think, I don't know if that makes sense. I feel like I kind of went all around there. But I think one of the verses that has been extremely important to me is that he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. And that will look the same for everyone. When he begins the good work, that doesn't mean he's going to bring redemption into every adoptive story out there, unfortunately, because like you mentioned, evil does have its touch in the world yet. But at the end, he is going to redeem everything, and it will be fantastic, and it will be beautiful. And so, that's a little bit of, I guess, the journey with attachment and, understanding that my mom loves me and I've treated her terribly. And her love, although highly unconditional, is conditional. There is a point where she is human. And so then understanding how vast, in contrast, God's love is. So I think understanding the way my mom loved me, even when I was absolutely horrible to her and abused her, was absolutely fundamental in understanding how much God loves me, and accepting that love personally. So that's a little bit of my journey through loving the Lord.
Loving the Lord.
And I love that.
All right, Trevor. So I would like to hear about how you first met Anne and your initial experience with Anne.
Oh, that's a funny story. So her and I met when one of my close friends married her brother. And one weekend we were down. Was it just to visit? Okay. And we were staying at her parents' house, and obviously my friends were there to visit her brother, and my friend. So we got there, and we were there for probably maybe 45 minutes or something. And her and her other brother were at a youth event, and they came back, and they opened the door, and in walks Anne, and very loudly saying, "Mom, Mom, Mom, guess what?" And then all of a sudden she saw us and got really quiet. So that was my introduction to Anne. That is the first time I ever met her.
And how old was Anne at the time? When was that?
21? 20?
I'm not sure.
Probably 20 or 21.
Yeah, 20 or 21, something in there. So.
Okay. Awesome. So then how did your guys' relationship, you don't have to go into details, but I was just trying to figure, how did it eventually obviously become where you two started dating, and now you're married now, so.
Mm-hmm. Oh boy. So that was probably in August. Yeah, beginning of August, the first time I met her, and then that following New Year's, so 5 months later, We came down to visit. Like in that 5 months is when my friend and her brother got married. So we came down again after they got married and we're visiting. And that was kind of the first time that I was like, oh, so there's this girl. That was kind of the first time I really noticed Anne in that on that level, that I was more or less romantically interested in her. And then just kind of went from there. I don't know. One small step at a time. And now here we are.
Yeah. Well, I feel like the Lord, again, that's kind of like where you see the Lord leading, right? Because like I wasn't sure. One of my things was like, oh man, like when any guy hears how nuts I was as a kid, like that's gonna not, and Trevor was so awesome. He loved like the Lord. He pursued me and he was willing to love even those parts. And so love me with those different, with that journey and with that story and with those and so yeah, I think that's even there I see the Lord leading, because Trevor's like, no, I actually think that's kind of cool, and I was like, all right. Awesome. And so even in our love story, I see the Lord being faithful once again, like yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe this is another thing. Sometimes my sister just got married on Saturday. So we had a great wedding. I mean, she doesn't have the same journey as you, but she was talking about her relationship with her husband, Tim, now. And she was saying that she has experienced, I mean, they've been doing spiritual direction together and they're pretty prayerful, but she didn't realize how, obviously there's a way we can carry this too far. People aren't made to fulfill us, but God uses people to heal us, just like your mom, and to point us towards him. So in your romantic relationship with Trevor, do you feel like that's also just, I mean, obviously you kind of just said it too, but I'm just thinking, do you feel like that helped heal? I mean, God uses all types of things to help heal us. And I know we're all still healing. But what do you feel is the difference between like the healing that you get from a romantic relationship versus at least, and it'd be personal to you, versus the healing that you got from your parental relationships?
Ooh, that is a very good question.
Hopefully it was a good question. Not just like, what?
No, that's a very good question. And that's not, I don't even know if that's something we talked a little bit about this last night, actually.
Trying to make sure we were all understood all the questions.
Yeah. But I think one thing, and mom did this too, but I think the way one of the things that mom did that was very healing for me is that she stayed. Even through all the ugly stuff I put her through and the way I abused her, she still stayed right there, and she still chose to love me and be my family there. And when I met Trevor at that point, like, I wasn't making all those ugly choices. I wasn't purposely trying to hurt him. And so it was a very different experience with love. And so I feel like the powerful thing with a parental love for me was that they stayed. Whereas what I found powerful with Trevor is that I don't know how I would even word it necessarily, but like he continues to it's more, I don't know how to, but like essentially my fear with my parents was that they wouldn't stay. And at one point, I mean, even what I wanted was that they wouldn't stay. Whereas, my fear with Trevor is that I wouldn't be worthy because he doesn't have all of the same attachment stuff that I do. And so, but he's continued to hold up that mirror and say, no, like, I love you. And despite your journey, despite those things that have made you, those painful things, I still choose to love you. And so I don't know if that makes sense or not, but the difference is, I think that, the fulfilling part for me has been that, I guess maybe it's just a continuation of the same thing, actually. Like mom initially was like, you're worthy to be my daughter. You're worthy to be, good enough, essentially. And Trevor continues to show me that. But the difference is the reaction of I was not actively trying to push Trevor away there. I don't know. That's a difficult question in some ways, but I think it's a really good one, and I will have to consider it more.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess it's also one of the stronger analogies in the Bible too, right? That God uses is his as a father, but also as our bridegroom. So
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
think it builds off of nature, right? He's built us for relationship
Yeah.
with each other and with him.
Yep. Yeah. Well, it is a deeper relationship in some ways. And so there's different levels that you know, you learn to know somebody on a romantic level versus a parental level. And so I think, you know, it's just deeper layers of healing, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. I didn't want to cut Trevor off. I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but you also don't have to say anything.
No.
Okay.
I feel like everything I had to say got covered.
Excellent. Okay. Okay, so and then in your guys' dating discernment, did you go to camp attach while you guys were just dating, or was it when you were engaged?
Both.
Both. Okay, good. I feel like that would just help you understand. I mean, I'm assuming that that's kind of part of Anne. So it would help your discernment.
I knew that if I chose Anne, I was also choosing Cam.
Yes. Yeah, and I guess you've already mentioned before that you're like, it just wasn't part of your world. So maybe it hasn't changed. Maybe, I don't know if you would say your view of adoption or trauma has changed, or if it's just become a reality. What would you say?
No, I would say that my perception of what adoption and trauma and all of those things, like from perception on that world, has definitely changed a lot. I mean, first of all, my wife has gone through all of that, and so understanding that, understanding my wife's journey, and then understanding also like other people's journeys has changed what I thought about. Like I would say my perception of adoption. It's hard to answer like how my perception of trauma has changed, because I would say that trauma really wasn't something I actively thought about, right? Like I think trauma definitely affects everybody's life. It's just that most people aren't aware of it. And so like, I guess you could say the perception of trauma changing is that I became aware of it, right? Like I began to be like, oh, that's a trauma response, you know, and seeing that in other people. So like that has changed a lot. But then like adoption, like I've seen the worst case scenario in adoptions. Like camp deals with mostly worst case scenarios. And for me, it almost has given me hope for adoption more than anything, which is like I don't think it's supposed to work that way. In the sense of like the horrors of it. But I think the reason that it gives hope is because that camp gives a way forward. Like in most of the time, like in adoption cases, like if things start to go down the wrong road, like you start seeing those behavior issues and things like that, there's no hope for that. It's just more or less like, oh, well, I hope they grow out of it, you know? And it's like, well, they're not going to. And so that's kind of what I thought about adoption and things like that. Like I had seen very few instances of it actually being successful, if that makes sense. Like, and so like being able to see children heal through the tools that Camp Attach offers has been very positive, reassuring.
Yes. And do you know, this is kind of a question I kind of asked Paul, but I didn't really get much of an answer, which is fine. Like, I know not every child heals, but I was kind of curious what how many kids have gone through either gotten help with Camp Attach or your kind of connections who have the same thing, who have improved? Yeah, I don't know if there's like, I mean, I was told with the little girl that I work with that there was nothing we could do for her. And I only went to camp once and I didn't even do the full thing. And all I did was kind of the like restitution and payback time and letting her figure it out. And that made such a big difference for her. Right. And we were told she was basically grow up to be a psychopath. I mean, I don't work with her anymore, so I don't know, but I know that she improved that last year I had with her like greatly. The points that the parents, they told me I could do it. And then after they watched me for a few weeks, they're like, okay, we have to do whatever you're doing because it's working. Right. So
The hard part about that is like, what do you consider success? Like,
okay. Good question.
Like sometimes success is that the individual is no longer harming others. Sometimes success is that they're actually able to hold a job, even though they don't have a relationship with their family. Sometimes success is that complete restoration that you see in Anne and her family, where they have built those connections back again. So like, what is success? And the other thing is like improvement. Like, I think that it'd be safe to say that most families, if they follow or if they use the tools that camp gives them, can see success in improving the situation. Sometimes the child will never improve, but camp gives mom and dad the tools to regain their lives rather than walking in eggshells in their own home, right? Like camp gives them the tools that they need to regain that power and that ability to be themselves. So I guess that's the hard part to talk about, like success and like improvement and things like that. Like how exactly do you define all of that? Yeah. Does that make sense? Does
that makes total sense. Well, that's a good point too. And actually, and Karen had mentioned this, like even though her first interaction with a child that was struggling, he still ended up struggling. He still was making bad choices. I guess it still is today, but the parents changed, right? So that's huge, right? Like
exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So and you said that so well. So that makes, like that makes it worth it, right? Obviously it'd be great if the child did make good choices, but man, if you can bring some peace to families, it's totally worth it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So then what was the interest in dog therapy? Like,
cool. That is one that I fell into accidentally.
Oh, okay.
So like that really hadn't been something on my radar at all until we got a puppy a few weeks after we were married, and Anna was like, it'd be really fun to like take Ophi with us, to camp, like as a therapy dog. And so then we began looking into it, like, what would that look like? What for training does she need to go through, like what for tests does she need to pass and things like that. And then it just, for some reason, I just kind of took over and here we are. The other thing is that like at camp, Anne has a very, Anne doesn't have time to work with the dog, like with the dog and with the kid individually. Versus like that, her role doesn't give her the time to do that. Versus like my role, if I have one, does. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's where Trevor is I don't know what you call it, sweet to my tea, if you will, because when we got this puppy, and we were looking at the requirements for a therapy dog, I was like, man, that is a lot of requirements. There's no way I'm going to have the consistency to train this dog. And he's like, I've got it. And he was fantastic at training the dogs. He has a real knack for training dogs. And so, he's superb at that. And Ophi has turned out to be a pretty good therapy dog.
Yeah, I enjoyed watching her work with, I guess, one particular kid. She might have worked with a few kids, but I remember one particular child. And yeah, it was just really cool. And just seeing how vital that was. And what was it called? Like pressure therapy or what?
Yes.
would you explain it?
So that's basically it's basically the same concept as a weighted blanket, like
Okay.
providing that security. Only this time it's with an animal who also has regular breathing. So we as humans mimic that regular breathing pattern we have, and that regular breathing is what allows our body to calm down and, step away from that fight, flight, or freeze mindset, and come back into our logic and reasoning. So that's kind of the goal of that. That is still very much a work in progress with Opie. As a 1-year-old puppy, it is not easy for her to lie still for long periods of time. So hopefully she'll grow into that a little bit more.
Yes. Yeah. And then, so, I mean, your life ended up taking a direction. So, but actually, let's go. Let's rewind a little bit. So before you met Anne, what were you doing? What were your goals? And then how have they kind of, shifted? I feel sometimes, even though my life has changed in the last few years, it's still kind of what I was looking for anyway. I don't know if that makes sense. Like the context changed, but the calling doesn't change.
Yeah.
But what did you start out with?
So I started out teaching,
Okay.
and this is actually my first year not teaching. So I would say that the desire to help people has always been there. And for me, it was through teaching. And then stepping into camp, there's no doubt that camp is all about helping families, helping people. So in some ways it has changed, but in other ways it hasn't. That makes sense.
Yeah. So what are you doing now? Are you able to make camp more of a thing, or is that what do you how do you guys survive? Just
I am actually a baker. So
okay.
My parents own a bakery. I work in a bakery. It's kind of more or less like a trade. And yes, the job that I have now does offer a lot more flexibility with being able to go to camps than teaching does. And that was one of the many reasons that I took this position. Okay.
Yes, that makes sense. Awesome. And then where would you say, so we talked a little bit about Anne's relationship with the Lord. What do you feel like for me, learning about trauma has improved my relationship with the Lord. I'm a little kinder to myself and a little more grateful to God. But what do you feel like where you're at and what you've learned?
I would very much echo that. I feel like for me, I know that I often can beat myself up over things, and allowing myself to be having grace for that, because in attachment, there is a lot of grace that you have to extend. If you base a child off of the actions that you're receiving from them, the screaming, the swearing, all of that stuff, you're not going to value that child if that's all that they are. But that child is not a son of their actions. They have worth. They have God so loves them even through all of that. And that same thing is true for me. Just because I mess up daily doesn't mean that God doesn't love me.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you guys have what are your kind of hopes for a future? And it sounds like you're still wanting to, I know you're still wanting to study and whatever, but do you have any thoughts on, I don't know, or maybe just take it one day at a time and see what happens, right? As camp kind of keeps evolving and but
yeah. We talked about this a little bit too. I think one of the hopes or the visions for the future is to just keep, like you said, keep being the healing hands of God how we can. For us right now, that looks like camp. That's one of the big ways we do it. I mean, also you have your daily life stuff, but camp is one of the bigger ways we see that happening. I think, yeah, eventually, we hope to be adoptive parents as well.
Yeah.
At this point. And so those are some of the ways. Yeah, I do hope to keep going back to college. I plan to go back and get my degree to be a therapist for children that struggle with attachment issues. And then we are looking forward to also beginning the journey of parenthood and raising our little guy, and I'm excited. One of the things I'm excited for, the hope I have, is to see childhood through the eyes of an attached child, because at this point that's not something we have. And so that's one thing I'm personally really excited for. So that's some of my goals, some of my hopes, the vision. But yeah, Trevor, I would love to hear from Trevor as well on that.
Yeah, like for me, I think it is a little bit more of a day-to-day thing. Like, how can I serve God today, rather than like I wouldn't say that I have my next 10 years plan on how I'm going to serve God every day. Like, you can't, like, that's not practical. But also, like, just right now it is camp, and maybe in 5 years it's going to be something different. I don't know. But giving hope in Jesus' name is what we have dedicated our lives to. And we hope to continue to dedicate our lives to that.
Yep. And I think just being safe people for, the world is hurting, right? And everyone has a journey, whether that's attachment or not attachment. Like you kind of alluded to, almost everyone has trauma, whether that's attachment trauma or other trauma. And so I think just being a safe place, I hope that our home is a safe place for people to come and just be who they are and who they need to be. And they don't feel like they have to have those walls up, or that, and so just being a safe place for people to let down their walls and guard, and just, find healing if they choose that. So yeah, that's a little bit about our vision.
I think that kind of sums it up.
Yeah, well, that's beautiful. And congratulations on having a baby. And also just for, I don't know what it's like for you guys in your, but I feel it's just so beautiful how anti-cultural it is. You got married young, you started your career, but you're having a baby, and that's okay, because it's not like the career is forever, but sometimes there's like a pressure of like, you have to get your career first and then you can have children. But you know what? I know people who had kids first and then finished their career, right? Like, and then they had the kids when they were younger and had more energy, and were still very successful in their career later, right? And it's just, so I just think that's beautiful, right? You weren't like, oh, like you're open to life, and it's important. And I mean, healthy, stable families is kind of what saves our society, right? So, so I don't know if you guys have any. I know that you're not like, and when I talk to Karen, I'll be like, what recommendations do you have? But I know you guys know people, like, other than camp. Like, do you feel like if for parents, I guess the other thing I'd like to do is talk about adult adoptees too, and if you have any encouragement for them. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but yeah. So if you were for families that are struggling, but also any encouragement for adult adoptees.
Yeah. So, well, I think for families, we hit on a lot of it. Number one, realizing they aren't alone. There are so many families out there struggling with adoption, and so, find if you can, find your community, find the community, and that's one of the things we do at Camp Attach, is try to develop that community of like, hey, here are some other fellow parents who are struggling just like you. And so finding that community, when you say, hey, it's been a rough day, all of those people know what that means. And so finding their community for families is important. And I think, camp is always a really good step for families. It gives the practical way of doing life, instead of just like, therapy is fantastic. And I think that's a super important piece of it. I think camp is an important piece of it. So for families, just knowing they aren't alone and then finding those resources. And I know resources can be hard to find too. I know that's easier said than done. So for families, I think that's some super important things. For adult adoptees, I was thinking about that a little bit before this interview here tonight. And that is a very difficult one. I think if they have the awareness that they have a problem and they need to fix it, that's great. The awareness is a big thing. Just understanding that that's where they're at. That's the first step. Once that happens, I think finding a therapist that can help give you the tools to stop creating those negative cycles over and over and over. And then also people who are willing to speak truth into your life. Because, trauma is based often in lies. Trauma is often based in just not truth. And so finding people who are willing to speak the truth, no matter if that makes you mad, if that hurts you, whatever, but who are willing to, boldly speak the truth over you there. And yeah, I think that's, just finding, for me, I think the biggest thing, even as I continue to heal and process is finding people who will speak truth over me. Because then, I can, and if it's people I trust, I trust that they're going to tell me the truth no matter what. And so I think as adult adoptees, that is really important. And then again, like a therapist to help you understand the negative cycles that you're trapped in, why you're trapped in those, and tools to help stop that, I think is very important. Yeah. And it's a difficult question to answer because like at some you just kind of have to do it. Like you just have to do the work. Like you just have to dive in, no matter how terrifying, no matter how scary, no matter how hard, no matter how frustrating, and just do it. And that's hard to do because you don't know what the other side is going to feel like, because you have no foundation outside of chaos and trauma. But it's worth it. I can say that from the place I am now. It's worth it. But it is a difficult journey, and it's a long journey. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah. So maybe just another thing too. I've just met in the last couple of years, I've just met a couple of people who are fairly healthy adults, but they have been adopted and they just carry a lot of grief. So I hope that just hearing you talk just gives them, it's the same thing with parents, right? You're not alone. There's other people who have a sense of what that's like. And I mean, everybody obviously it's unique to you, but there's still some sense of like, oh, I'm not the only one who feels this. And like, it doesn't make me defective. Right?
Yeah,
it doesn't.
Right. Well, and finding, and I guess, also in addition to finding people you trust that are willing to speak truth over you, people who you trust that are also willing to walk right with you and sit with you in the hard stuff and not try to make everything okay or fix it. Because part of it is just being okay with the pain of it and understanding, just processing that grief. And so, I think that's a really important thing that you mentioned there about, you're not, like you said, like there's people who are maybe not completely, unhealthy, but they're also not completely healthy. And just having that space to talk about it and the way it's affected them. And I think, that's something that is becoming more common, but has a lot of room to grow in society at large.
Yeah.
What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like she has spoken well.
She spoken very well. It was awesome.
I don't really know what to add to that.
Okay. Well, that was awesome. Do either of you feel like there's anything you wanted that you felt left unsaid, or?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah. I think so. I think you did a really great job. Thank you so much for inviting us to do this. It was an honor, and it's been an honor to work with you at camp as well. So yeah. No, I think you did a really awesome job.
Yeah, thanks for having us. We appreciate being able to speak hope into other people's lives.
Mhm. Yes, it's a very small audience, but there is some people here who are just like, I'm like, you have to meet these wonderful people that I've met. Right, and there's a lot of people that feel alone. So I thank you
Yeah.
so much. It's good to see you.
You too.
Same to you.